Hello class and welcome back. For today's lesson, we're going to be exploring a topic that's incredibly important. You've definitely heard about it before, but for today we're going to be placing this in the context of world history. So please title your notes The Great Depression. Just for the sake of time, we are going to be moving through this information very quickly. As always, feel free to pause this video so that you can take notes or get clarification as needed. So I always like to begin with this chart because it really showcases the different economic indicators that you'll start seeing during the Great Depression era. Take a look at the unemployment rate in the United States. It's going to rise 607% as a result of this economic crash. Similarly, if you look at the production models and the different price markers in other nations, you'll see how dramatically the Great Depression really is going to impact all of these different places. So the question you obviously have is, how does this actually happen? What's the cause of the Great Depression? So almost universally, we really see the US stock market crash of 1929, aka Black Tuesday, as the catalyst, the first event that really sets off this global panic. So it's not only this, there are also a couple other economic indicators that are important to point out. But first, let me just emphasize this one point. At the time, people were doing something called buying on the margin, which essentially means they were purchasing stocks with money that they really didn't have. So they would be borrowing money, purchasing a stock, and then obviously as the market crashes, not only did they lose their money, but they also had to pay back the money that they had borrowed in the first place. Additionally, consumer personal debt was also growing. People were buying more than they were before: appliances, cars, new technologies, and as a result, the amount of debt families were in was expanding. Also, agriculture really suffered after World War I. During the Great War, soldiers needed things like crops and food, so farmers were doing exceptionally well. Once the Great War came to an end, the need for farmers, the need for agriculture, shrunk. Also, industries were overproducing during World War I to account for the conflict. They were making soldiers' uniforms, guns, machinery, weapons. Now that the war is over, those things are no longer needed, so those industries begin to suffer. And also, things were really just changing at the time in terms of modernization. So, a lot of old economic staples that were really profitable before were being replaced by new ones. In this transitional state, a lot of those markets started to vanish. So in this image here, you can see a crowd gathering outside of the New York Stock Exchange on what's called Black Tuesday. This chart showcases the fall of the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 1929, and you can see just how sharp of a fall that really is. So what happens when the stock market collapses? There is mass panic. What starts to happen is people start to form bank runs, which is essentially when people rush to banks to withdraw their money. So now don't forget, when you put your money into a bank, the bank doesn't necessarily hold on to the physical cash. They invest the money. They basically lend it out to other people. So when all of these people rush to banks, it really forces them to close. They don't actually have enough money to give back to people. And don't forget too, at this time, people's money was not insured. So essentially, if your bank failed, you could lose everything. The suicide rate among white American males reached an all-time high during the Great Depression era, and you'll see in modern day there are actually safeguards to prevent banks from failing and people from losing all of their assets. So not only this, but because banks were failing, they were forced to call back personal and business loans too. So if you had borrowed from a bank, you might have to pay that money back very quickly because the bank was failing. And again, you can see in this image, this is a crowd outside of the American Union Bank lining up obviously to withdraw their money. And the same thing here. These are protesters protesting the failure of their banks. So the United States government initially takes several actions to try to curb the blow of the Great Depression. One of the first and most unsuccessful comes in the form of a tariff, specifically the Hawley-Smoot tariff. So the U.S. created a tariff on 20,000 imported goods. And now, don't forget, a tariff is essentially a tax on goods coming into your country. So, what's the goal of this? The hope is that Americans would start buying things domestically. They'd start buying things at home instead of buying them from abroad. The hope was that if U.S. citizens were buying things from within their own country, that it would stimulate the economy. But what are other nations going to do when you put a high tax on their goods? They're going to do the same thing. European nations put tariffs on US goods, so businesses actually, in many cases, started doing worse because they were losing that market of potential customers in other countries. This is truly astonishing. Unemployment was skyrocketing at the time. Between 1932 and 1933, the absolute worst point of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was 25%. One out of every four people was out of a job. So compare that to today when the unemployment rate is about 3%. It's truly astonishing to think of such a high figure even being possible. This is the cyclical nature of the US economy, though. So take a look at this. This is cyclical unemployment. Say, for example, the demand for cars drops because people have lost money in the stock market, right? Because the demand for cars has dropped, the automakers lay off some of their workers. Because people have lost their jobs, right? And these manufacturers need less materials to buy their cars, to build their cars, they stop buying things from those businesses. So as a result, those businesses lay off some of their workers. Because these people have lost their jobs and they have less money to spend, the economy as a whole begins to shrink. So just to get this down in your notes in a really easy to understand way, um, unemployment is really going to come from a decrease in demand for different goods. As citizens start buying less, businesses start making less money, and they start laying off more workers. People start losing their jobs because obviously less workers are needed, and because they have less money, they're going to buy fewer goods. This chart really showcases the change in unemployment. The Great Depression is primarily going to take place during the presidencies of two US presidents, Herbert Hoover and FDR, who we'll be talking about a lot during the Second World War chapter. You'll also be exploring his presidency a lot in US 2 as well. He'll serve for 4 different terms, the longest of any US president. This, of course, showcases the infamous bread lines, men lining up with their paychecks to buy bread for their families as conditions began to grow more and more dire. This is also a fascinating example as well, the example of the bonus army. So here you're seeing 43,000 protesters gathering outside the US Capitol building. These are actually World War I veterans. They're demanding basically their military service payments early for their service during World War I from the government because their incomes either have fallen or they've lost their jobs. Here you can see those same veterans protesting in Washington, D.C., and being put down by police officers. So, in this class, we talked about classical economics quite a bit. We talked about the birth of capitalism, its founder, Adam Smith, the wealth of nations, and how essentially classical economists argued that the government should largely stay out of business. Think of like laissez faire, let do, hands off governing. The government really shouldn't get involved. So, initially, economists really are going to see the Great Depression as a natural phenomenon. Historically, don't forget, we've always seen a bust after a boom and a boom after a bust. During World War I, the US economy is doing well, so many reason that eventually the US economy has to see a bust as well. The problem is, as these economists argue that the market will self correct, time is passing and it's not doing that. In the meantime, people are doing worse and worse. Between 1929, the year of the actual crash, and 1932, people are making very little money, they're still losing their jobs, and the common people are continuing to suffer. So now enter John Maynard Keynes. So Keynesian economics is really a principal idea of economics that's based on his ideas. So he argued in the long run, we will all be dead. So this is really criticizing the classical economist saying that the market will self-correct. Keynes says instead we really can't wait that long. And he publishes these ideas in a tract on monetary reform in 1923, a few years before the Great Depression. He writes, economists see themselves too easy, too useless a task if in the tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again. Again, saying it's kind of ridiculous that economists argue that the market will self correct, looking back in retrospect, when in the meantime people are doing so poorly. So in Keynesian economics, he's basically arguing that a fall in demand is causing the Great Depression and a new equilibrium has been created, basically a new middle ground of where the economy really is. He argues that the government should really step in and they should start spending to stimulate the economy and put more money back in the hands of citizens. He says, yes, this will raise deficit spending. This will put the United States into more debt, but it will also stimulate the economy. People will have more money, they'll start spending more money, and it will get the economy moving once again. So these ideas are largely going to be adopted by President Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, in his New Deal legislation. This is his domestic agenda. So, the first order of business, he orders a bank holiday, which basically forces all of the nation's banks to close for 1 week to regroup. He then encourages everyone to put their money back in the banks. Secondly, he creates what's called FDIC, which is insurance to protect people's money. So, for instance, if your bank fails or it closes, you will not lose all of your money, you will not lose all of your assets. The government will insure that. In modern day, I think it's about $250,000 the government insures for each private bank account. So, take a look at this. This is an image of one of FDR's famous fireside chats. So don't forget, this is primarily before television. FDR would often get on the radio and speak one on one with the public in a very conversational tone. In one of his most important fireside chats, he reassured the public to put their money back in the banks and rest assured that the government had things under control. And you'll see in this chart that after the bank holiday in March of 1933, the actual money supply in the country does largely improve. This is very important, so you might just want to put this as a side note in your notebook. It's not the New Deal that helps the US economy recover. Instead, it's the outbreak of World War II. This is what's going to grow the US economy to be this massive balloon and really situate the United States to become the preeminent superpower of the world. As the world once again gets pulled into war, the US really gains the opportunity to make a massive profit off of it. And that's what really curbs the effects of the Great Depression. In terms of the New Deal, several different programs are going to be created. You can see some of them pictured on the bottom of the screen, all different sorts of things. FDR called for what he called the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And essentially, these were all different programs putting Americans back to work. It might be things like the CCC, allowing young men to clean parks and pave roads. It could be things like the WPA, building, private schools. Interestingly, my high school was a WPA project. All sorts of things like this that put Americans back to work and in the meantime stabilized the situation for many American families. So we're going to pause here today. Understand that the lasting effects of the Great Depression are not just going to hit the United States, but it's also going to impact regions all over the world, particularly Germany. Even though Germany recovered a lot after the situation with hyperinflation, the Great Depression is going to impact the people there in a very dramatic way and provide yet another catapult to push Hitler closer and closer to power.